Habejari's Break by Kimber Camacho from the J. Henge anthology Other Days. Nuska'a came to a stop where their humble footpath met a larger, broader road, her breath clouding around her piquant face and bright green knitted hood. There's Habejari's Break, she pointed along a flattened path leading to the stone border of the valley's northernmost edge. At the end of the path, maybe 4 or 5 miles away, was a vertical crack in the wall of the ancient caldera that formed the valley. Huffing a bit, too, Dayel looked at the huge wall of dark stone stretching in a shallow curve for miles. Impressively high, the natural barrier must have been about as tall as an orbital shuttle, maybe 4 or 5 levels in an average building. At the lowest points he could see easily half again that height at the place where the long, dark fissure lay, which Nuska'a was pointing out to him. Dayel licked his chapped lips and indulged his curiosity. Who's Habejari, and did they make that break or just discover it? Snorting, Nuska'a's grin was almost as white as the snow around them. Habejari was the eldest child of the pilot who brought the colony here. He had that restlessness in his blood, you see. Built flying things since he was a nibbling, learned all the tech he could do, and was very nearly a genius with making things go. Well, and making things go boom also. Dayel chuckled in appreciation of the mental image and the intentional humor in Nuska'a's tone. She pulled out a flask and offered Dayel a sip of the warm brew she'd made before they'd set out from the edge of the settlement. Hours ago now. Thanks, Dayel murmured before taking a drink of the hot, thick stuff. A bit like bean brew mixed with fine-grained porridge, and just short of too much sweetness to balance that hint of the right kind of bitterness underneath. Somehow it tasted even better when he knew where all the ingredients had come from. The dark gold honey harvested from carefully monitored hives, the warm scent of the boiled grains, and the freshly ground roasted beans which had filled Nuska'a's humble kitchen with their heady aroma. Bracing indeed, and fortifying while warming a body's core well. So did Habejari make it go boom then? Nah, not deliberately, Nuska'a said with a rueful shake of her head, rubbing at the chapped skin below her goggles. He was juicing up a ground effect vehicle, one of the sleds we use for transporting trade goods between our settlement and the one yonder on the big mountain overlooking the landing site, or occasionally to the southern settlement. The flitters are too expensive to run often, and with us in this valley, the ground path around to the west slope takes weeks by unpowered ground travel, 3 to 4 days in one of the ground effect sleds, and he wanted it to go faster than the regular sleds, of course, and carry a heavy load, obviously. Nuska'a took a swig from the flask and resealed it. He got it done, better than the specs he'd set out to meet, and made a few test runs that impressed everybody. Problem was, Habejari wasn't satisfied, kept tweaking and tuning. Uh-oh, Dayel said softly, already anticipating the end. Nuska'a nodded, lifting one shoulder with a rustle of her parka. Yeah, he ramped up the power until that transport hummed with it. They had a need for some of the homemade explosives we use for shifting old stumps or boulders, as well as some meds up at the mountain, and Habejari was going to save time by going the most direct route, intending to build up speed on the slope there. Nuska'a pointed to the right-hand slope of snowy ground, indeed like a natural ramp toward the top of the valley wall. Figured he could easily make the leap by spiking the thrust at just the right moment. Didn't work, Dayel surmised, turning to look at the crack in the caldera wall, which had to be the length of a large flitter up close. Giving a little grunt of dry amusement, Nuska'a shook her head. Nah, it actually did work. The vehicle shot up and over the edge of the wall. She paused long enough that Dayel looked back at her again with raised brows, and she went on with a breathy sigh. Habejari was excellent with tech, but not so strong with common sense sometimes. The vehicle was prime. However, he got so wrapped up in faster, farther, that he didn't check the couplings on the load pod. Gesturing with a bright green glove, Nuska'a described a high arc and spoke as her fingers traced the arc down and down toward the ground. The pod broke loose, skewed to the side, and impacted the wall near its base there. Ah, no, Dale murmured in sympathy as Nuska'a nodded. The explosion was heard all the way at the southern settlement, near Biggest Lake. Then the sound of the wall shattering, cracking. It was frightening as anything anybody'd ever heard before. Habejari was just at the apogee of his trajectory, right above the impact spot at the moment of the explosion. Nuska'a shook her head slowly. The fuel cells ignited from the heat. All they found of either part of the vehicle was charred bits of metal and plastomer. Poor gent, said Dayal, also shaking his head, having long since learned to ignore the slight off-center pull of the insignia on his blue regulation cap and cowl. Hope it was quick. Yeah, it probably was, but still. She shrugged and made a less direct gesture towards the break in the stone caldera wall. Once the debris was cleared away, they discovered the break went all the way through. Possibly the explosion had stressed an existing fracture or something. Even the angle of the bottom of the fissure only needed a little tuning to make a gently sloped path to the other side of the wall. So you got your more direct route after all, Dale summarized pensively. That we did. So in his honor, though it was more by accident than design, we named the break after him. We like to think he'd have got a grin out of that. Maybe so, Dale agreed, shaking his head again. Seems a lot of trouble, though, settling in this valley, making it so hard on yourselves to get out again for trading and such. Nuska'a gave a philosophical little tilt of her head, bright smile flashing again. It was a calculated trade-off. We get a storm break from the spring bluster. The soil's unbelievably rich with minerals and nutrients. You've seen our harvest records. And as well as the hot springs to the east, we've got a line running down an old lava tube to passively convert the thermal energy. Making a considering sound, Dale nodded. For a fairly new colony, they'd made excellent progress on many fronts, crop production being amongst the most notable. We had plans to put in a request for a construction team to come out and put a break in the valley wall when we'd built up some more trade cred, Nuska'a offered, expression turning whimsical at the end. Not to make light of his passing, but Habejari saved us that expense as well as the time we'd have spent building that cred. Our best expectation had been 3 cycles, maybe 4. Shrugging, she made a quick little gesture with one gloved hand, which encompassed a flick in the direction of Habejari's break, a sweeping arc upward, and then a nearly universal spreading of both palms upward, concluding with a wry little smile. The universe has an odd sense of humor. I do wonder sometimes, Dayal muttered, unable to disagree, and then spoke more clearly. Such strange things happen out on these frontier worlds. It's a bit frightening, but a bit amazing, too. Looking thoughtful, Nuska'a tilted her head in acknowledgement as she shook the loose snow off the grav nets affixed to her boots, obviously preparing to continue along the path they'd originally been following. Suppose you'd hear them a lot, being an inspector. I sort of collect them, actually, Dale admitted, just a bit sheepishly, feeling somewhat self-conscious. I plan to publish someday. Do you mind if I add your story? Not at all, Nuska'a shrugged. Why shouldn't the story of Habejari's break find some new ears, or eyes, as the case may be? My thoughts exactly, Dale grinned, following Nuska'a readily. I'll credit you with the telling, too. Kind of you, Nuska'a murmured, sounding a little surprised. But by then all Dale could see was the back of her vivid green parka, the strips of reflective tape throwing glints and flickers of green-tinged light upon the snow, and sometimes across Dale's more sedate blue and white regulation issue uniform. Mind yourself along here. Ground's a bit choppy since the herds came through just after the secondary sun topped the horizon. Bet you folk can't wait for spring, eh? It was difficult to really grasp living through a winter lasting 3/4 of a Terran standard year, but these colonists had been managing for nearly 5 standard years. Nuska'a chuckled. Oh, no bet there. You should stay for the festival. It's only about an 8th standard away or so. Looking around at the still wild, snowy landscape, inhaling the sharp bite of the icy but pure air, Dayel felt a wistful little thread of agreement sneak through him. I'll certainly think about it, he said softly, and Nuska-A's glance back around at him was a smiling one, which sparked the pull of an answering curve at Dael's lips. He didn't even try to resist. Plenty of stories traded at the festival, she offered leadingly. And it'll be over with time enough to get off-world before the spring bluster kicks up and grounds the shuttles. Dael just laughed, shaking a gloved finger at her. Ah, now, no fair twisting my arm. Don't think I have to, actually, Nuska-A said knowingly. With a widening grin and a quickening of his step, Dael shook his head. No, not even a little. Clever, you. Nuska-A's grin lasted a while, as did Dael's, and he was mentally mapping out his leave request as they trudged along to Dael's next destination in this inspection tour. Do you have any of your other stories with you? Nuska-A asked when they paused to observe a large herd of woolly-coated ungulates with multiple horns and almost comically large hooves. These beasts were bred from Terran stock, but were much larger and hardier than their ancestors. Dael aimed his scanner at the animals ambling in aimless arcs and circles, watching how the beasts roamed the area without wandering too far from the rest of their fellows, the adults scraping holes in the snow with their big, tough hooves to nibble the mossy growth beneath the snow. The herd had increased by 10% since the initial census, and, even if Dael was not specifically educated on these particular animals, he could see they were healthy and content. Saving his best scan of 3, he glanced sidelong at Nuska-A, not bothering to hide the return of his smile. I've got the whole collection on my personal media pad. Good way to pass the time, I expect, Nuska-A observed, the set of her mouth hinting at a smile, though she kept her face in soberly musing lines. Might be. He finally turned to look at her directly, brows lifting. Will you join me when you're free to test that theory? Her hint of a smile bloomed into an unrestrained version almost at once. Be happy to. She cocked her head at the pathway. Ready to continue? Tucking away his scanner, Dael nodded, indicating she should lead the way. They walked a little closer thereafter, and she elaborated on specific facts, as well as related anecdotes, whenever Dael showed an interest. It seemed like no time at all before they had to turn back, though 4 more hours had passed unnoticed. And here Dael thought this run was going to be boring.